So for these videos, I think I'm going to dispense with the JPEGs and the background music and all that, because I want to keep these as short as I possibly can. I like to talk a lot, that's why a lot of my videos are a little long, so I'm going to do my best to keep these as short and to the point as much as I possibly can, so they don't interfere with me doing other videos. But anyway, let's recap A Tale of Two Stans. So as usual, there's going to be spoilers for this episode, so if you're not caught up with Gravity Falls, stop the video right now if you don't want anything spoiled for yourself. So the episode picks up right where they left off. The author comes through the portal, Grunkle Stan is like, "Brother!" and then he punches Grunkle Stan right in the face. That is a hell of a way to start an episode. So then we find out that the author's name was actually Stanford, and Grunkle Stan's name was Stanley this whole time. It wasn't Stanford as he's been referred to, and we'll get more into that in a second. But then Stanford speaks, and he's voiced by J.K. Simmons. Ah! Sorry. So then we get a flashback of when Stanley and Stanford were growing up. They used to live in New Jersey, and considering Stanley's personality, that makes a whole lot of sense. They liked to go on adventures, they hung out with each other, they were practically inseparable, and the problem was Stanford was very gifted and smart, whereas Stanley was Stanley. He was very he's kind of a delinquent, very troublesome. When they got older, Stanford was going to be accepted into a college, and Stanley kind of ruined that for him by accident, and it caused him to get thrown out of the house, and that's how he became sort of a con man. He was trying to learn how to make money by scamming people and getting banned in different states. Meanwhile, Stanford actually went to college, he worked hard, he got a government grant, and he was trying to figure out what to study, and he decided that because he was born with 6 fingers, he wanted to study anomalies, things that were weird. So he looked throughout the entire country to find a place where he can study those, and of course, the place with the most anomalies was Gravity Falls. So he moved there, he built his cabin, and he was studying all kinds of things, a lot of stuff that we've seen already throughout the series. So he theorizes that because there are so many weird things happening in Gravity Falls, they have to be coming from somewhere. So he thinks that there's an alternate universe where all these things are leaking out. So he calls McGucket, who was a college friend of his, and they build the portal. But unfortunately something goes wrong and McGucket almost gets sucked through, and he comes out kind of kooky, and that's kind of where his whole thing gets started. So he calls up Stanley because he's the only person that he can trust at this point. But unfortunately by the time Stanley gets to the cabin, he's sort of lost his mind a little bit, so he shows Stanley the portal and tells him that this is my work, this is my life's work, and I need your help, and you're the only person I can trust. But unfortunately there's still some issues there, because Stanford is still kind of upset with Stanley because he got him kicked out of college, but Stanley didn't really do it on purpose. Talking about Stanford and Stanley is very confusing, I'm just going to be honest. So they get into a big fight, they accidentally activate the portal, and Stanford gets sucked through. Stanley's left there with the journal, and he's been trying to get the portal going all this time, but people in town notice him, and he's still trying to learn how to make money. He's ran out of money at this point. People in Gravity Falls start thinking that Stanley is Stanford, or the scientist that nobody really knew about, and he takes over his identity, and he creates the Mystery Shack to raise money for himself to keep himself supported. Which brings us to where we are right now, and the government is still looking for them. They almost find out where the basement is, but luckily Dipper just happened to have one of the mind erasers from the Society of the Blind Eye, which Stanford knew about apparently. So Stanford takes the gun and he uses it on all the government agents, and they all get sent away. I think that's a bit of a cop-out, but at the same time it's a good way of getting rid of the obvious problem that we were left with. Then this episode ends on a very unsettling note, because after the agents get taken care of, Stanley and Stanford are talking, and Stanford says, you know, you can stay here and take care of the children, but unfortunately when the summer's over, I need you out of my house. And Stanley's like, wow, you're not even gonna thank me for taking you out of the portal? And Stanford just glares at him, and they just sort of walk off on each other. Then we cut to Dipper and Mabel in bed, and Mabel wants to know if they're gonna end up like Stanford and Stanley. You know, inseparable twins, but then something happens between them and it all goes wrong. So Dipper's like, nah, nothing's gonna happen between us, good night. And then the episode ends with Mabel just sort of lying in bed, you know, like this. Like, And that was very unsettling to me. Yeah, way to end your episode on a very foreboding note. Jeez. So this was a great episode to come back with. There was so many details, so many questions were answered. We also got to see how Stan got his tattoo. We also got to see how Lazy Susan's eye got messed up. And the biggest one was we actually got to see the third Pines brother, Dipper and Mabel's grandfather. He was a baby, but still we got to see him, so that was pretty cool. But I'll be honest, there wasn't a lot of humor in this episode. I mean, there were a lot of funny moments. I liked the... After Stanford couldn't get into his dream college, he had to go to community college, and it was called Backups More. I thought that was really funny. But it was a very heavy, intense tone throughout the entire episode, and I thought it was great. I think at this point the series has earned that kind of thing. But even though we got a lot of questions answered, there were a lot of new questions that came up. For example, when Dipper showed Stanford the mind eraser gun, he said, "How did you get a hold of one of these things?" One of these things? Does that mean there are more of those? Also, the mind eraser gun was an invention of McGucket, and then eventually it got into the hands of the Society of the Blind Eye. So, I don't know if Stanford should know what that thing is. Another thing to note is that when Stanley showed up, Stanford showed him the first journal, and he said, "This is my research, but I've stumbled onto something completely crazy. I want you to take that journal, and I want you to bury it where no one can find it." So instead, Stanley was going to burn it, which... really, if you don't want people knowing things, that's the best thing to do about it. And then Stanford just tackled him. He said, "No, don't burn it!" So, why would he want him to bury the journal but not burn it if he didn't want people to see it? Because, you know, you could bury something and someone still might find it, but if you burn it, it's gone forever. So, that was kind of a weird moment. There's also a lot of speculation on if Stanford was the same person that went through the portal, because... when McGucket went through the portal, he came back and he was speaking backwards and he was saying all kinds of babbling things. So we think that maybe when something goes through the portal and then comes back out, it might not be the same. You know, if you ever seen the movie Event Horizon, you know what I'm talking about. Also, a lot of people are speculating that that is not Stanford at all. That could possibly be Bill Cipher. It was established in a previous episode that Bill Cipher can take the form of anyone he chooses. So for all we know, that's not even Stanford at all. That might be Bill. The last thing is possibly a huge continuity issue, because if you saw the episode Dreamscapers, when they went into Stan's head, they established that Stanford, this is getting confusing. Stan Lee was a wimp as a child, and his father gave him boxing lessons, and that sort of toughened him up. However, when we saw the flashback of when they were kids in the Jersey Shore, Stanley was clearly already a tough kid, and Stanford was the nerdy one. I really want to believe that Gravity Falls wouldn't let a huge continuity issue like that go, so I'm thinking that either Stanley was lying because he wanted Dipper, he wanted to push Dipper to his potential. He wanted to, you know, like he said, when the world fights, you gotta fight back. He wanted to teach him that, so he probably just made up the whole story. Or perhaps that was sort of a memory that Stanford had, not Stan Lee. But if you remember that scene where Grunkle Stan was in the ring fighting the guy in the background, there's another person reading a book, so that could have been Stanford. I mean, I don't know. This one, I don't know. I'm going to wait and see if this one plays out somehow. But besides all that, like I said, it was a great episode, and I can't wait to see the next one on August 3rd. God damn it, Disney! I looked up the synopsis for that episode too, and I don't think it's going to continue this story arc. It sounds like a filler episode. Wait a minute, August 3rd? That's my birthday! Alright, well, I guess I'll get cake in a new episode of Gravity Falls where Weird Al Yankovic is the guest voice star. I guess I can't be too mad. So again, great episode, but let me know in the comment section what you thought of this episode. My name is Rob, and I'll see you in the next one.